Morning report, and the government has launched a royal commission to investigate abuse in state institutions, but there is still scope for the inquiry to be widened. It'll be chaired by the former Governor-General, Sir Anand Satyanand, and it'll look into abuse between 1950 and 1999. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern expects the government will make a statewide apology for historical state care abuse once the inquiry is complete.
This, I think, is a significant step towards acknowledging and learning from the experiences of those who are abused in state care. But the fact it is a royal commission, the highest level of commission of inquiry that this government is able to establish, acknowledges two things: the independence that survivors and victims asked us to provide this inquiry, and just the level of impact it's had on individuals' lives and their view of the state.
Ms Ardern says the Royal Commission's expected to cost $12 million in its first year, and that the government will adequately fund it in the years that follow.
Our hope is that we will have an opportunity as a government to see this process through to its end. We've asked Sir Anand to take 3 years to hopefully be in a position to start hearing from individuals from around mid-year, and that we will have a report back before the end of this parliamentary term. But we accept it may take more time.
There's been criticism, though, from survivors of abuse in other institutions, such as churches and sports clubs. They say exclusion from this inquiry will compound their suffering as their voices are ignored once again. We've received statements from Gymnastics New Zealand and New Zealand's Olympic Committee, who say they'll fully comply with the inquiry and would be open to a broader scope. Swimming New Zealand Chief Executive Steve Johns declined to comment. Christian Churches New Zealand says it fully supports an inquiry looking into churches and schools. The Catholic Church said last month that it would be open to being included in the scope of the inquiry, and we spoke last night to the Primate of the Anglican Church in New Zealand, Archbishop Philip Richardson, who had this to say.
If the inquiry had been extended to include children in the care of other organisations and institutions, including the church, we would have been very willing to have cooperated completely with that.
The Minister for Children, Tracy Martin, says the inquiry is about people, not institutions. So if people were hurt in state care, regardless of where they were placed, they are within scope.
If a young person was in our care and the state enrolled them into a Catholic boarding school, say, and they were harmed there, they are in scope. If they were in our care and they were on a holiday school camp, but the state was responsible for them and they were harmed at that school camp, they are in scope. This is about the people, not about the institutions.
Bishop Richardson says his church will fully cooperate with the inquiry in those cases. Sir Anand Satyanand will be consulting on the terms of reference before they're finalised, and he's with me in the Wellington studio. Kia ora, good morning.
Kia ora, good morning.
How do you see the scope of this inquiry? Do you feel that it needs to be widened so that it does include institutions like churches?
The terms of reference have been produced in draft, and they are very wide. It gives scope for anyone that has been in a state institution or as a result of an action by a state official, the right to come before the Commission and to make known their views. I want to stress, though, that the draft terms of reference are at the very beginning, and I'm going to be spending the next weeks consulting throughout the country, if needed, with people and organisations in order to make sure that the terms of reference are clear and understandable, and that will then become the foundation document for the Royal Commission to do its work.
So it does sound from what you're saying that things like churches, sports clubs may well end up coming under that remit because of their link to the state.
It's very early to say anything like that. In fact, I don't think so. You've heard the Prime Minister and the Minister of Children speaking about restricting the Royal Commission to the actions of the state, and I think that will be what prevails.
In that case, talking further about restriction, why do you think it's appropriate for this scope to be 1950 to 1999?
It is 1950 because that is when children's homes, began to be in operation in full. There had been experience of people in state care before that, but the homes, as they are called, began in about 1950. And the cut-off is 1999 because during the 90s there emerged in New Zealand mechanisms such as the Health and Disability Commissioner, such as the Human Rights Commission, such as the Privacy Commissioner, and the Ombudsman, of course, all of which provided redress for people in state care who had an issue with what was happening to them.
Nonetheless, we have heard over many months previously from lawyers, for example, who say they have clients, some of whom are as young as 17, who are coming forward saying that they have been abused in state care. And they are going to be left out of this inquiry. What do you think about that? Is it reasonable?
I think the 50-year time period is reasonable because I have some experience of this because I chaired the Confidential Forum for Former Inpatients of Psychiatric Hospitals, which it sat in 2005, and we did not receive many people who had had experience of treatment before 1950. So to cut off that line seems to be sensible. To cut off the line at 2000 is also sensible because people have legal redress and redress through other agencies available to them.
But they are still part of essentially a community of people. They're in the same boat as the people who were abused in 1999. If they were abused in 2000, what really is the difference when you're trying to look at the overall scale of the problem?
I think your question overlooks the main focus of the Royal Commission, which is looking at the children's homes and state institutions that were operational principally in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. That is the main focus, and that will provide the principal burden of the work that the Royal Commission will do.
What about compensation? Is this something that should be on the table? Should it be revisited? And indeed for people who've already individually settled claims with the government when that was the way the national-led government seemed to be doing things over the last few years, how should that all be disentangled?
Again, that will be one of the aspects that the Royal Commission will get to. The first is the gathering of information. There'll be an investigative, and then there will be an assessment, analysis, and adjudication, if you like. And lastly, there'll be the matter of atonement, in the context of which there will be consideration of things like an apology, things like compensation, if that is thought to be appropriate.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming into the studio in Wellington as well. That's Sir Anand Satyanand, who is going to be chairing that Royal Commission into abuse in state institutions. It's now 7:45.
Let's get back to the aftermath of the weather yesterday at